I knew that Monday was going to be strange before I even left my bedroom. Not because of anything dramatic, just a small feeling in my gut, the kind you get when something in your routine is slightly off. I woke up earlier than usual actually, because that morning mattered to me. I had a job interview scheduled at Atlas Defense Systems, a company I had been trying to get into for weeks. 3 weeks of preparation, research, mock interviews, studying their tech division, the whole thing. For someone like me, a former military engineer who preferred machines to people, interviews weren't exactly my favorite activity. But this one felt important. The kind of opportunity that could reset your life a little. I remember brushing my teeth and checking the time on my phone. 6:46 a.m. I still had plenty of time. My plan was simple. Shower, coffee, drive out by 7:30. Easy. That was the plan. Then at exactly 6:47 a.m., I heard an engine. Not just any engine. The kind that sounds like it's trying to wake up an entire neighborhood. Loud, aggressive, the kind of sound that makes birds scatter from trees. I walked to the window with my toothbrush still in my mouth, thinking someone must have gotten lost in our quiet little cul-de-sac. Then I saw it. A candy apple red Lamborghini Aventador, parked sideways across my driveway. Engine still running. I stood there for a moment just staring at it, trying to process what I was looking at. Because this wasn't the street where Lamborghinis just appeared at sunrise. Then the driver's door opened, and out stepped Karen Blakeley. If you've ever lived near someone who thinks a homeowners association is basically a small kingdom, then you already know the type. Karen was the president of our local HOA. At least she claimed to be president forever. She was wearing designer workout clothes and a bright pink HOA windbreaker like it was some kind of official uniform. Oversized sunglasses. Phone already in her hand. She walked around the car like she had all the time in the world, opened the trunk, and pulled out a yoga mat. I watched her roll out directly in front of my driveway gate. Then she propped her phone up on a little tripod, adjusted the angle, and clapped her hands once like a director starting a scene. "Welcome back to Mindset with Karen," she said loudly enough that I could hear her through the window. "Today we're talking about claiming space." I nearly choked on toothpaste. Claiming space. She stretched her arms dramatically toward the sky like she was performing on stage. "Sometimes," she continued, "you have to remind people that shared communities mean shared spaces." At that point, I spat the toothpaste out, grabbed a shirt, and headed outside. I didn't slam the door. I didn't yell. I just walked down the gravel path toward my gate and stopped a few feet from the Lamborghini's mirror. Karen glanced over at me like she had just noticed I existed. "Oh, good morning, Darren," she said in that syrupy voice people use when they're pretending to be nice. "Love the flannel. Very country chic." I pointed toward the car. "You're blocking my driveway." She tilted her head like she was considering something deeply philosophical. "Well, technically," she said, stretching one leg behind her like she was still doing yoga, "this access lane is part of the community circulation zone during shared hours." I blinked. "That's not a thing." She shrugged. "It is now. Passed the vote last Thursday." "You? And who?" I asked. "Your cat." She gasped like I had insulted royalty. "Mr. Whiskers is our treasurer." I rubbed my face. I didn't have time for this. "Karen, I have somewhere to be." She took a slow sip from a stainless steel water bottle and looked at me over the rim like she was evaluating a problem child. "Well, Darren," she said, "community living requires patience." "I have a job interview," I said, "in about an hour." She smiled. Not the friendly kind. The kind that means someone knows exactly what they're doing. "That sounds stressful," she said. I stared at the car again. Bright red. Parked sideways like it was posing for a magazine shoot. "Move the car," I said calmly. She didn't move. Instead, she picked up her phone again and started recording another clip. "Remember, everyone," she said to the camera, "boundaries are emotional constructs. Sometimes we must release the idea of ownership." I felt something in my forehead pulse. "Karen." She turned toward me slowly. "Yes, Darren. Move the car." She lowered the phone. "Is that a threat?" I smiled politely. "Not yet." Then I turned around and walked back toward my house before I said something that would make the situation worse. Inside, I called the local non-emergency police line. The dispatcher was polite, but not exactly helpful. Since the vehicle wasn't abandoned, and since my property sat right on the edge of the HOA boundary zone, it might take a few hours before someone could come out and sort it out. A few hours. My interview was in 80 minutes. I hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen staring out the window again. Karen was still out there, doing yoga poses next to the Lamborghini while talking to her phone like she was hosting a motivational podcast. I checked the time again. 7:05. My stomach started to sink. I had spent 3 weeks preparing for that interview, and I was about to miss it because my neighbor wanted to film a yoga video about personal boundaries. At 7:18, I tried calling Atlas Defense Systems to explain the situation. Straight to voicemail. At 7:41, Karen finally finished recording. She rolled up the yoga mat slowly, chatting with 2 other women who had apparently arrived to join her. They laughed about something while pointing toward my house. By 8:10, the Lamborghini was gone. I sat in my truck staring at the empty road for a while before putting the key in the ignition. The interview had been scheduled for 8:30 downtown. Even if I drove like a maniac, I wasn't making it. I tried calling again. Voicemail. I drove anyway, hoping maybe they would still see me. They didn't. By 9:15, I was standing outside the Atlas Defense Systems building listening to the receptionist politely explain that the hiring manager had already moved on to other candidates. I nodded, thanked her for her time, and walked back to my truck feeling like someone had just taken a hammer to 3 weeks of effort. The drive home was quiet. When I pulled into my driveway, something new was waiting for me. A glittery pink envelope taped to the gate. I already knew who it was from before I opened it. Inside was a laminated notice. HOA courtesy warning. It said my gate structure might violate new community visibility guidelines. The letter was signed in purple gel pen. Karen Blakeley. There was even a small heart drawn next to her name. I stood there for a long moment staring at that letter. Then I looked down the road toward Karen's house. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't about yoga, and it definitely wasn't about shared community space. Karen had decided I was a problem, and she was going to keep pushing until I either complied or left. I walked out toward my backyard slowly, past the fence line, toward the old barn sitting at the edge of my property. Most people in the neighborhood assumed it was just a storage building. They'd never asked what was actually inside it. I opened the barn doors halfway and looked at the machine sitting quietly in the center of the concrete floor. A fully restored M60 tank. Decommissioned. Street legal. 52 tons of steel that I'd spent 2 years restoring piece by piece after leaving the military. I ran my hand along the side of it and thought about Karen's Lamborghini parked across my driveway that morning. Then I looked back toward the road. All right, I muttered to myself. Let's see how far she wants to take this. And at that moment, I had a feeling the neighborhood drama was only just beginning. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere important to be this time, but because my brain refused to let the situation go. The interview was already gone. That opportunity had closed the moment Karen decided my driveway was the perfect stage for her morning yoga performance. I made coffee, stepped onto the porch, and looked down the street toward her house. Everything looked perfectly normal again. Quiet, calm, like nothing had happened. That was the thing about people like Karen. They created chaos and then acted like everyone else was overreacting. I took a slow sip of coffee and noticed something at the edge of my yard. A wooden post had been hammered into the grass near the fence line overnight. I walked closer. A freshly printed sign hung from it. HOA Expansion Zone, Future Community Development. I stared at the sign for a few seconds and then laughed under my breath. She was claiming my land now, not even subtly, just planting a sign like a conqueror dropping a flag. I pulled the sign out of the ground and tossed it into the ditch. Before I even reached my porch again, Karen's voice floated down the road. That's destruction of community property. I turned and saw her walking toward me, flanked by 2 men in khaki pants and polo shirts, holding clipboards like they had just stepped out of some low-budget property inspection show. Karen stopped at the edge of my driveway and crossed her arms. "Good morning again, Darren," she said with that same sugary tone. "You really shouldn't remove official markers." I glanced at the 2 clipboard guys. One of them looked uncomfortable already. The other was busy writing something down while pretending not to listen. "That sign was in my yard," I said. Karen smiled. According to the updated boundary map, it's part of the HOA development zone. Updated by who? I asked. She lifted her chin proudly. By the board. I step a little closer. Karen, my property predates the HOA by 20 years. One of the clipboard men coughed awkwardly. Karen ignored him. Community planning evolves, Darren. You can't expect the neighborhood to revolve around your rustic preferences. I looked back toward the barn behind me for a second, then back at her. Get off my property. The man with the clipboard finally spoke. We were just asked to verify the easement boundaries. His voice sounded like he'd rather be anywhere else. I nodded toward the road. Then verify them from over there. Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. Honestly, Darren, you make everything so difficult. The two inspectors exchange a look. After a few more awkward notes and photos, they slowly retreated back toward Karen's car. Karen lingered for a moment, staring past me toward the barn like she was calculating something. Then she gave me a tight smile and walked away. I stood there for a while after they left, the morning air suddenly feeling heavier than it had a few minutes earlier. Karen wasn't just being annoying anymore. She was escalating. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the county office. The clerk behind the desk looked half asleep when I explained the situation. She typed for a moment, frowned at the screen, then leaned forward. This boundary update was filed by someone named Karen Blakeley, she said. But it's marked as a temporary annex request. Temporary? I asked. Those take months to process, she said slowly. This one says approved within 48 hours. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Approved by who? She scrolled down the document again and shook her head. That's strange. The approval field is blank. I stared at the screen with her for a moment. Fraud. It wasn't subtle anymore. Karen had literally redrawn the map and dared anyone to challenge it. On the drive home, I started thinking about the tank again. Not in an aggressive way, just as a reminder that I didn't have to sit quietly while someone tried to bully me off my own property. When I pulled back into my driveway later that afternoon, another envelope was waiting on the gate. This one wasn't glittery. It looked more official. Emergency Safety Inspection, the letter read. HOA Fire Hazard Assessment, for PM today. I checked my watch. 3:52 p.m. I couldn't help laughing again. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. I walked back to the barn and opened the doors all the way for the first time in weeks. Sunlight poured across the concrete floor and lit up the tank, sitting in the middle of the space like some kind of sleeping giant. I wiped a little dust from the metal and stepped back just as a car pulled into my driveway. Karen stepped out first, followed by the same two clipboard men and a third guy wearing a vest labeled Fire Risk Evaluator. Karen's smile widened the moment she saw the barn doors open. Darren, she said sweetly, we're just here to make sure your storage structure isn't a hazard to the community. The evaluator stepped inside and stopped dead the moment he saw the tank. Is that real? He asked quietly. I nodded. Restored M60. Fully registered. Karen jumped in quickly. But surely something like that requires HOA approval. I walked over to a workbench and picked up a folder I had prepared months earlier for insurance reasons. I handed it to the evaluator. Inside were the federal registry papers, state permits, and documentation confirming the vehicle was classified as historical military equipment. He flipped through the pages slowly, eyebrows rising higher with each document. Karen hovered behind him like a mosquito buzzing around a light. Finally, the evaluator closed the folder and handed it back to me. Everything here looks legitimate, he said. Karen blinked. Excuse me? He shrugged. He's allowed to store it here. Karen stared at the tank again, like it had personally insulted her. You're telling me he can just keep a tank in his barn? I leaned against the workbench. It's not just a tank, Karen. It's a historical vehicle. The two clipboard men suddenly found the ground very interesting. The evaluator nodded politely and started walking toward the door. Have a nice afternoon, he said. Karen didn't move for a few seconds. She just stood there staring at the tank. Then she slowly turned toward me. This isn't over, she said quietly. I met her gaze. I figured. She left without another word. That evening, I walked the perimeter of my property, checking the fence line out of habit. That's when I noticed the camera mounted on a tree just outside my boundary. It hadn't been there before. I followed the wire with my eyes until it disappeared behind the hedge that separated my yard from Karen's. She wasn't done, not even close. She had just changed tactics. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table staring at the map printout from the county office. Karen wanted control, and people like that never back down unless they lost something bigger than their pride. I folded the map slowly and set it aside. Then I glanced out the window toward the barn again. The tank sat quietly in the dark, exactly where it had always been. For now, and for the first time since that ridiculous Lamborghini blocked my driveway, I started to realize something. Karen thought she was playing neighborhood politics. What she didn't realize yet was that she had just started a war she couldn't win. Karen didn't show up the next morning. That alone told me she was planning something. People like her didn't retreat unless they were preparing a new angle. I spent the first part of the day doing normal things just to keep my mind off it. Changed the oil in my truck, cleaned up a few tools in the barn, ran the tank engine for a couple minutes to keep the systems healthy. Nothing dramatic, just routine. But the whole time, I had the strange feeling that someone was watching. Around noon, I walked the fence line again and stopped beneath the tree where the small camera was mounted. It was angled directly toward the barn doors, toward the tank. I followed the wire again with my eyes, and sure enough, it disappeared into Karen's property line. I shook my head. She was building a story, collecting footage, probably hoping to paint me as the unstable neighbor with military hardware sitting in his backyard. That afternoon, I decided if she wanted a story, I might as well give people the real one before she wrote her version first. I logged into a few local community forums and posted something simple. Just pictures of the restoration process. Old photos of the tank when I first bought it. Rusted panels. Broken hydraulics. Then newer photos showing the rebuild. I explained the mechanical work, the history behind the vehicle, and how it had become a personal project after I left the military. I wasn't trying to make a big statement. I just told the truth. By evening, a few people had already commented. One guy said his grandfather had worked on similar vehicles decades ago. A local high school shop teacher messaged me asking if his students might be able to see the restoration sometime. It was harmless, educational even, exactly the opposite of the narrative Karen seemed to be aiming for. The next morning, I woke up to something new. A large banner stretched between two poles near the entrance of the neighborhood. Community wellness event, Saturday morning yoga. I didn't even need to read the name printed underneath. Karen Blakeley. I sighed and kept driving. But when Saturday morning came, things escalated faster than I expected. At around 8 a.m., the streets started filling with cars. Not just neighbors either. Some had camera rigs. One guy had a drone case. A few people looked like the social media influencer type. Bright athletic clothes. Phone's already out. I stepped onto my porch with a cup of coffee and watched the whole thing unfold like a slow-moving circus. Karen stood in the center of it all wearing a pastel workout set and wireless headset microphone. Behind her, someone had set up a small portable stage facing the street. The banner now read, Yoga with Karen. Find peace in shared spaces. And directly behind the stage, perfectly framed for every camera, sat my barn. I laughed quietly under my breath. Of course she had done it here. Karen raised her arms dramatically and greeted the growing crowd like a motivational speaker stepping onto a conference stage. Good morning, everyone, she announced. Today we're practicing mindfulness and reclaiming community energy. I leaned against the porch railing and took another sip of coffee. Several people were already taking selfies with my barn in the background, like it was some kind of tourist attraction. One influencer with a ring light whispered to her friend while pointing at the doors. Is that the tank? She asked quietly. Karen heard that question immediately. Her smile widened. Yes, she said loudly into the microphone. Our neighborhood has recently experienced certain displays of militarized objects. I almost admire the phrasing. Karen had a gift for turning nonsense into dramatic language. She continued stretching her arms toward the sky while speaking into the mic. But instead of reacting with fear, we choose peace. That was enough for me. I set the coffee cup down and walked toward the barn. The moment the big doors slid open, several cameras turned in my direction. People whispered to each other as they saw the tank sitting inside. I climbed up into the driver's hatch and turned the ignition. The diesel engine roared to life with a deep mechanical rumble that echoed across the street. Half the yoga crowd jumped. Karen froze mid-pose on the stage. Slowly, deliberately, I drove the tank forward until it stopped just inches from my property line. I didn't cross it. Didn't need to. The engine idled loudly, while the massive metal frame sat there like a silent reminder of reality. I climbed back down and leaned casually against the side of it. Every camera in the area shifted away from Karen and toward me. The influencer with the ring light immediately started filming. Someone else launched the drone into the air. Karen tried to recover control of the moment. "Remember, everyone," she said through the microphone, forcing a laugh. "Today is about calm energy." But the crowd wasn't paying attention to her anymore. They were staring at the tank. A couple people even walked closer to the fence for a better look. One older man nodded approvingly. "That's an M60, he said to his friend. "You don't see those restored very often." Karen's expression tightened. The yoga mats slowly rolled up as people drifted toward the fence line to take pictures. Within 15 minutes, the entire event had completely lost focus. The drone operator flew a slow circle around the tank, while someone else asked me a few questions about the restoration work. Karen lowered the microphone slowly. Her perfect event had collapsed in less than 20 minutes. Eventually, she stepped down from the stage and walked toward me with controlled steps. The smile was gone now. "You're enjoying this," she said quietly. I shrugged. "I'm enjoying my property." She looked up at the tank again. For the first time since I had known her, Karen didn't have a clever line ready. Instead, she turned around and walked away toward her car while the rest of the crowd continued filming. By noon, the yoga mats were gone. The stage was dismantled, and the entire street looked like nothing had happened. I shut down the tank engine and rolled the barn doors closed again. For a moment, I thought maybe that was the end of it. Maybe Karen had finally realized the whole situation was getting ridiculous. I should have known better, because that evening my phone started buzzing with messages from neighbors I barely knew. Someone had uploaded a video from the event online. The caption read, "Tank versus HOA drama." The video was spreading quickly around local groups. Most of the comments weren't exactly supportive of Karen. Apparently, a lot of people in the neighborhood had their own stories about her rules and citations. Suddenly, my driveway problem wasn't just my problem anymore. Karen had spent years building authority in the neighborhood. But that morning, for the first time, people had started laughing at her. And when someone like Karen loses control of the narrative, they usually do something desperate to take it back. I had a feeling that desperate move was coming soon. I just didn't know how far she was willing to go yet. The quiet didn't last long. Monday morning started with another letter in my mailbox. This one looked a little more official than Karen's usual glittery envelopes. Plain white paper, bold header, community disruption notice. I stood there in the driveway reading it twice just to make sure I understood what it was accusing me of. According to the document, several anonymous residents had reported concerns about psychological intimidation caused by military hardware displayed in a residential neighborhood. I actually laughed out loud at that line. Psychological intimidation. The tank hadn't moved an inch off my property. I hadn't driven it through the street. I hadn't threatened anyone. I just turned the engine on once while Karen tried to run a yoga festival in front of my barn. But Karen was clearly trying to turn the situation into something bigger than it was. And she wasn't done escalating. 2 days later, a pair of county safety inspectors showed up at my gate. Not HOA volunteers this time. Real county officials in blue jackets carrying tablets and clipboards. One of them looked uncomfortable before he even spoke. "We received a report about potential hazardous equipment on private property," he said. I nodded and stepped aside. "You're welcome to take a look." They walked in the barn with me and stopped in front of the tank, just like the fire evaluator had the week before. One of them circled it slowly while the other checked the paperwork I handed over. Federal Registry documents. State permit. Historical vehicle classification. The same folder I had already shown Karen's inspection crew. The older inspector looked over the paperwork and nodded. "Everything here checks out," he said. His partner actually smiled a little. "Honestly," he added, "this thing's in better condition than most museum pieces." They took a few photos for their report and left 20 minutes later. Another dead end for Karen. Or so I thought. That evening I started getting texts from a few neighbors again. Apparently Karen had gone door to door telling people the tank was unsafe and that I might try to use it during a future HOA meeting. One neighbor even forwarded me a short video clip someone had secretly recorded at a small gathering Karen hosted in her backyard. She was standing beside a table of wine glasses, explaining how the neighborhood needed to protect itself from unstable behavior. Unstable behavior. I watched the video twice, shaking my head. Karen had officially crossed from annoying into full smear campaign territory. I printed the clip transcript along with copies of the tank registration and the county inspection report and sent it to a small local newspaper along with a short message explaining the situation. I didn't expect much. Maybe a small opinion piece, if I was lucky. But the next morning the story actually ran online. The headline read, "Local resident targeted over restored military vehicle." The article was surprisingly balanced. It mentioned Karen's yoga event, the legal permits, the failed attempts to classify the tank as a hazard. Within hours, the article started circulating through the neighborhood Facebook groups. For the first time since this whole mess started, people were openly questioning Karen's behavior instead of just accepting her authority. That afternoon, the next escalation happened. I heard shouting from outside and stepped onto the porch just in time to see Karen standing near my gate waving at a tow truck driver. The poor guy looked confused. She was pointing dramatically at the barn while talking on her phone. "That vehicle needs to be removed immediately," she was saying loudly. "It's a safety violation." The driver walked halfway up the driveway, took one look at the tank sitting inside the barn, and slowly backed away toward his truck. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm not touching that." Karen spun around when she saw me standing there. "This is unacceptable," she snapped. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Say that again," I said calmly. Her tone changed instantly. "I was just asking questions about the vehicle," she said quickly. Then she turned and walked back toward her car. But something about the way she moved bothered me. She was holding something small in her hand. Later that night, I found out exactly what it was. One of the motion cameras I had installed near the barn pinged my phone around midnight. I opened the video feed and watched Karen standing just outside the fence line with a flashlight. She looked around nervously before stepping closer to the barn doors and reaching toward a small maintenance panel on the side of the tank. She was trying to open it, probably hoping to tamper with something or claim the vehicle was unsafe afterward. It didn't matter what her plan was. The camera had caught everything clearly. I downloaded the footage and sent it straight to the county sheriff's office the next morning along with a trespassing report. That's when things really started unraveling for Karen. By afternoon, the HOA group chat was exploding with messages. Someone had posted the newspaper article. Someone else had posted screenshots of Karen trying to get the tow truck involved. Then another neighbor somehow got a copy of the security footage showing her near the barn at midnight. People who had stayed quiet for years suddenly started sharing their own stories. Random citations, weed Venus, garden decorations labeled as visual hazards. Karen had spent so long intimidating people that nobody had realized how many of them were frustrated until someone finally pushed back. Around sunset, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Evelyn from 2 houses down was standing there with a small envelope in her hand. She was an older woman who had lived in the neighborhood longer than almost anyone else. "My husband used to work on tanks during Vietnam," she said with a gentle smile. "He would have loved yours." Then she handed me the envelope. Inside was a printed petition signed by more than 20 residents calling for an emergency HOA meeting to review Karen's conduct as president. I looked at the list of names slowly. Some I recognized, others I barely knew. Evelyn tapped the top of the page with one finger. 30 signatures triggers a board vote, she said. We're already halfway there. For the first time since the Lamborghini blocked my driveway, I felt the balance of power shifting. Karen had started this whole situation believing she controlled the neighborhood. But now the neighborhood was starting to look at her a little differently. And once people begin questioning someone's authority, it becomes very hard for that person to hold on to it. I thanked Evelyn and watched her walk back down the driveway. Then I looked toward the barn again, where the tank sat quietly behind the closed doors. The machine hadn't moved more than a few feet since this entire mess started. But somehow it had become the center of the biggest neighborhood conflict I had ever seen. And something told me the real finale was coming soon. Because Karen Blakeley wasn't the kind of person who gave up quietly. But now she wasn't the only one preparing for the next move. Saturday morning arrived earlier than I expected. I woke up to the sound of car doors outside and the low murmur of voices drifting down the street. For a second, I thought someone was having a garage sale or something harmless like that. Then I remembered the petition. The emergency HOA meeting had been scheduled for that morning at the community clubhouse 2 blocks down the road. I made coffee, stepped onto the porch, and looked toward the street. Cars were already lining both sides of the road, more than I had ever seen for any HOA meeting. People were actually showing up. I took my time finishing the coffee, tried to decide if I even wanted to go. Technically, I wasn't even part of the HOA. My property sat just outside their official boundary. But after everything Karen had tried over the last few weeks, it felt strange not to at least see how this played out. By the time I walked down the street, the crowd had grown even bigger. Folding chairs were set up in front of the small clubhouse building, and at least 50 residents were standing around, talking quietly. Karen stood near the front, wearing a crisp white blouse, like she was preparing for a press conference. Her posture was perfect, chin slightly raised, hands folded calmly in front of her. If someone had walked up without knowing the situation, they would have thought she was about to give a speech about neighborhood beautification. But I noticed the tightness in her smile, the way her eyes kept scanning the crowd. She hadn't expected this many people. A few residents noticed me walking up and stepped aside to let me through. I didn't say anything. I just stood near the back of the crowd and waited. Karen eventually stepped up to a small portable microphone and cleared her throat. "Good morning, everyone," she said smoothly. "I understand there have been concerns raised recently regarding community safety and leadership transparency." She paused like she was giving the audience time to appreciate her professionalism. As president of the HOA, my only priority has always been protecting the peace and character of this neighborhood. A few people in the crowd exchanged looks. Karen continued, her voice calm and practiced. "Unfortunately, certain individuals have chosen to escalate minor disagreements into public drama." She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. Everyone knew who she meant. I kept my arms folded and stayed quiet. Karen went on for several minutes about safety concerns, responsible leadership, and the importance of community values. It was the kind of speech that sounded good if you didn't know the details. Then someone near the front raised a hand. "What about the boundary map?" the man asked. Karen blinked once, but recovered quickly. "A clerical misunderstanding," she said smoothly. Another voice spoke up. "And the tow truck." A murmur moved through the crowd. Karen's smile tightened. "A precautionary inquiry," she replied. That was when the low rumble started echoing down the street. At first, most people didn't notice it, but Karen did. Her head turned slowly toward the sound. The rumble grew louder. A few people stepped aside as the source came into view around the corner. My friend Carlos sat behind the controls of the tank, guiding the massive machine carefully down the road at walking speed. The sunlight reflected off the metal surface as it rolled closer to the clubhouse. Across the front of the tank, a large banner had been secured. The words printed across it were simple: historical vehicle, fully registered, fully legal. The crowd erupted into laughter and applause as the tank came to a gentle stop along the curb. Carlos shut down the engine and climbed out with a grin. Karen's mouth opened slightly. She looked from the tank to the banner and then to the crowd around her. The entire narrative she had been building for weeks collapsed in about 10 seconds. Phones came out everywhere as people started recording. Karen tried to speak again, but the moment had already slipped out of her control. That's when a woman in a navy blazer stepped onto the small stage beside her. She held a thin folder and spoke clearly into the microphone. "My name is Rebecca Lang," she said. "I'm here representing the county oversight office." The crowd quieted instantly. Karen looked like someone had just unplugged her power source. Rebecca opened the folder and began reading calmly. "Over the past several weeks, our office has received multiple reports concerning unauthorized HOA actions." She listed them one by one. The altered boundary map, The attempted enforcement of HOA authority over non-member property. The unauthorized installation of surveillance equipment. The attempted removal of legally registered personal property. Karen tried to interrupt once, but Rebecca raised a hand without even looking at her. As of this morning, she continued, Karen Blakeley is suspended from her role as HOA president pending further investigation. A stunned silence hung over the crowd for a moment. Then several people began clapping. Karen stood there frozen. Her carefully controlled image had completely shattered. She looked around at the crowd like she expected someone to defend her. No one did. Slowly, without another word, she stepped away from the microphone and walked toward the parking lot. Her small group of loyal supporters followed behind her in awkward silence. Within seconds, she was gone. Rebecca closed the folder and stepped away from the microphone. The meeting quickly turned into a chaotic mix of conversations, laughter, and people gathering around the tank to take pictures. Someone handed me the microphone, but I didn't have a speech prepared. I looked out at the neighbors standing around and shrugged. I never wanted to fight, I said simply. I just wanted my driveway back. That line earned more applause than anything Karen had said all morning. The meeting wrapped up not long after that. By afternoon, most of the chairs had been folded away, and the street returned to its usual quiet state. Later that evening, I walked back down my driveway and noticed a small basket sitting on the porch. Inside was a toy Lamborghini, a plastic tank, and a bottle of wine. Tucked between them was a short handwritten note. Next time, just run it over. No name, just a quiet joke from someone in the neighborhood who had clearly enjoyed the show. I stood there for a moment looking out toward the barn as the sun started to set. The tank sat inside exactly where it belonged. Silent again. In the weeks that followed, Karen officially resigned from the HOA board. Evelyn ended up becoming the new president after the community voted for a full restructuring of the leadership. One of the first things she did was rewrite the HOA guidelines so no future board could claim authority over properties outside the official boundary again. As for me, something unexpected happened the following Monday. I received a phone call from Atlas Defense Systems. Apparently, someone from the company had seen the local article about the whole situation. The hiring manager laughed when he introduced himself. If you can survive a suburban war zone, he said, you'll probably handle our engineering department just fine. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The driveway stayed clear. The barn stayed quiet. And every once in a while, a neighbor would walk by and ask if they could see the tank up close. I never drove it over Karen's Lamborghini. I didn't have to, because sometimes the real victory isn't destroying something. Sometimes it's just standing your ground long enough for everyone else to see who is actually causing the problem in the first place.